Star Wars! The prolific space opera media franchise that spanned over 40 years and has touched the hearts of millions. Everybody loves Star Wars, right? I mean, you got the, there's the old movies. Everybody likes those, right? There's the prequels. I mean, well, they weren't as good, but a lot of people still had a good time, right? There's those TV shows about the wars with the people that all look the same. Those are cool. Well, yeah, lots of kids like those. Even some adults swear by them. Yeah. But then we come to the issue of Disney Star Wars. Much like the prequels, love them or hate them, to say that the sequel trilogy is free of fan controversy and beloved by all would be incredibly ignorant at best and disingenuous at worst. The sequels have fueled a discourse about the current state and uncertain future of Star Wars with no shortage of vitriol. Some frankly embarrassing behavior by some more unhinged critics of the newest films in the series has unfortunately resulted in a great deal of legitimate criticism also being dismissed under an unfair umbrella of ist terms. On the other side, many fans that argue certain flaws in the writing of the sequels are less important than some would claim has resulted in them being labeled any number of names. Extremists on both sides claim the others aren't true fans, gatekeeping the likes of which the more reasonable among us would never engage in, but it occurs nonetheless. The fandom seems fractured and broken. Is there anything that can save us? That can heal the schism between us and unite us under the banner of Star Wars once more? Enter The Mandalorian! Run by Jon Favreau, credited by many as ensuring the success of the early phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with the surprise hit Iron Man, and featuring rising star and sexy, sexy man Pedro Pascal, as well as an inarguably cute puppet, The Mandalorian seems a breath of fresh air for Star Wars, exploring a transitional period in the fictional history and straying, mostly, away from the high-stakes tales of the Jedi, the Sith, and galaxy-spanning conflicts. A personal level space western with an entirely new cast of characters and new locales, while still being totally recognizable as the franchise we all know and love. Thanks, John. Thanks to your vision and expert direction, Star Wars is saved. But is it? After taking a closer look, I honestly can't say I feel that way anymore. You see, as I watched the confrontation between Moff Gideon and Din Djarin aboard Gideon's cruiser in the finale of Season 2 for the first time, I realized that I wasn't worried about Din at all. I never once felt a moment of tension in the fight. I knew he was going to make it through no problem, unscathed and uninjured. I didn't just believe in him. I didn't just root for him. I knew for a fact he was going to be absolutely fine. And I realized it wasn't just me. The events of the show itself had set me up to feel that way. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve, and today I'll be examining some problems I have with The Mandalorian. Specifically, The Mandalorian Season 2, and even more specifically, the ruination of stakes and tension by basically every action scene in Season 2, and how the persistent lowering of stakes by each and every action scene that precedes the confrontation with Moff Gideon ultimately leads to that very confrontation's failure to evoke tension in a discerning audience. Now, much of what I'm going to discuss is also a problem, some of it to a lesser degree, in Season 1. But aside from the occasional Season 1 dips for reference and comparison purposes, I will be focusing my criticism on the second season, as I believe the problem is far more pronounced and transparent in these latest episodes. I'll be using examples from other pieces of media both within the Star Wars universe and without to flesh out and support my argument. So let's begin by talking a little bit about tension in action scenes, why we may feel tension and believe in the stakes regardless of what we may or may not know outside the text of the media. Now, clearly it's not unusual for a person with half a brain and meta-knowledge of television production, actor contracts, and fan influence on media to know that the hero of the show is going to survive at least the vast majority of the show, with some fairly notable and recent exceptions, which, by the way, have been met with great praise for their stakes and the uncertainty of any given character's continuation despite their status or perceived importance to the story. but it's safe to say most television shows will have the same main character or characters throughout. Keeping an audience engaged throughout a series with a constantly refreshing cast of characters can be a titanic task, so this is understandable. The obvious course of action is to not kill off your main characters, and so the audience will not expect or worry too much about these characters meeting an untimely demise. But many shows still find ways to establish stakes and evoke tension from the audience. This can take the form of innumerable opportunities for loss, failure, and death and destruction in the world around our characters. This is where I believe it's important to state that it is not necessary that any of these things actually happen to establish or maintain tension. Does it help when we can see the actual consequences play out before our eyes on screen? Absolutely. But all that is necessary to establish tension is for the characters to act like the consequences of death or bodily harm could happen believably and consistently. For example, in the beloved 1988 action movie Die Hard, the protagonist John McClane, a police detective visiting his estranged wife at her office Christmas party, does just this. He runs from danger, hides behind cover, and does not run into danger and expose himself unless he is absolutely sure he has the jump on one of the armed robber goons that have taken over Nakatomi Plaza. He does get shot, eventually, and it is no surprise that he does, as he has several close calls prior to that. The villains are shown to be able and willing to use deadly force, and have motivation to want him dead. So in Die Hard, we have a vulnerable protagonist, who is shown to be in danger against villains that have a level of competence high enough to be dangerous, which is both displayed to the audience, and the protagonist acts in a reasonable manner often enough that by the time he does something that's not quite so smart, we can still reasonably fear for his safety based on what we've seen before. This behavior can all be drawn from having a firm set of rules in your universe. Die Hard is meant to take place in the real world, or one very much like it, so that the rules of the world are easy to understand. Bullets pierce flesh, resulting in injury or death. Sufficient cover can stop bullets. Glass can cut your feet if you're not wearing shoes. Gravity makes German terrorists go down. In concert, all these things work rather well, even if there are some more moronic moments that don't hold up under closer examination later. We as an audience can be completely invested in this scene because of what we've seen before. The Mandalorian Season 2 has absolutely none of this with any consistency. Do I expect Star Wars to follow all the rules of the real world as Die Hard does? No, but I expect it to follow its own rules. The Mandalorian doesn't get injured at all in Season 2, which by itself is fine, because as we've already established, it's not absolutely necessary. But Steve, you say, Din gets blown to hell in the Season 1 finale, which sets up the stakes fine. He doesn't have to get injured more. It's already been... Shut your mouth! I'm getting there! I've got something for you, person. Believe it. It does matter that he doesn't get injured, however, when he also repeatedly acts as if he cannot be injured. The rules of how he can be injured are turned on or off flippantly to suit the goals of the writers. Enemies consistently appear to deliberately target his invincible armor, and the enemies he fights are either hilariously incompetent in the case of rank-and-file stormtroopers and such, or woefully underdeveloped as a potential threat in the context of their actions in the case of Moff Gideon. So, let's dig into all these problems in The Mandalorian Season 2.
Gideon has a weapon that once belonged to me. It is an ancient weapon that can cut through anything.
Almost anything.
It cannot cut through pure Beskar.
This line in itself is a statement of fact, for the Star Wars universe at least. A weapon has limitations. It can pierce anything except a certain material. A rule has been set for this universe, and this rule is a good thing, to be sure. It allows us to know what to expect, and can help us understand the stakes in any given engagement involving the Darksaber and Beskar armor. The wielder of the Darksaber will have to be a competent melee combatant, and will have to be patient, clever, ingenious, and maybe a little lucky to land a proper blow on a trained warrior clad in a full suit of Beskar armor. I mean, hell, if a character with no setup as a trained or competent melee combatant had to go up against an enemy covered in plating made of the sole material their weapon was incapable of penetrating, we'd feel a little nervous for that character, yeah? Because their enemy is ideally suited to repel their attacks. They have no obvious skill that can allow them to circumvent their enemy's armor. Are you starting to understand why this setup is kind of backwards? Moff Gideon is the clear underdog in this fight by a wide margin. And he's not some tragic anti-hero that we don't want the Mandalorian to hurt, but has been brought into conflict with Din due to misunderstanding. He is a clear-cut villain who kidnaps and experiments on children for the purposes of bringing the Empire back to glory. And the fact that we hate him and he is a bad is not sufficient to establish tension to see Din come out on top. See bad guy? Feel scare? Doesn't work on a lot of us, John. We need to be shown why the villain is formidable, or at least told for God's sake. Now I understand there is more context to this scene than simply the fight between Din and Gideon. There may even be reasons why Moff Gideon would intentionally set himself up in a losing fight, and we will get to that also. But let's go a little deeper into why this fight is so lopsided and devoid of tension. You may not have noticed Din Djarin actually became completely invulnerable to bodily harm from all forms of blaster fire, explosions, melee weaponry, and literally everything else between the events of Season 1 and Season 2, but he did. That's right, the Mandalorian acquired an upgrade to his Beskar armor in the intervening period, which projects a dual attraction-repulsion field which draws all projectiles and melee attacks to his armor when possible, and repels the rest, causing them to miss completely. A common retort to my claim that the Mandalorian's armor makes him completely invincible and at no risk of danger from Moff Gideon at the end of Season 2 is, "Steve, you big dummy, you're so dumb. Look at all the gaps in his armor. He could easily be injured in the gaps in his armor where he's covered only by clothing." Well, that does certainly seem to be the case. There are quite a few gaps in that armor. The arms are uncovered between the pauldrons and the gauntlets. The neck looks vulnerable between the helmet and the cuirass. The cuirass itself has a pretty sizable gap between the breastplate and the back piece that holds his jetpack. That's not great for a warrior whose fighting style requires him to raise his arms all the time, but it's fine. Just never stand in Weaver stance and never get flanked and you'll be alright. Oh. Anyway, the cuirass stops about halfway down the belly, and the armor doesn't pick up again until the cuisses, leaving the entire pelvic girdle exposed. And let me tell you, if you've never received a single well-placed bullet to the pelvic girdle, well, don't. Then we've got a little gap between the cuisses and the vambraces as well. That's a lot of gaps, guys. Geez, maybe I stand corrected. Seems like with sufficient exposure to danger, Din would have to pull off something pretty spectacular in order not to get hit somewhere. That's right, Steve. So the final fight is tense. Moff Gideon could cut off his arm or a leg, or even plunge the darksaber down into Mando's neck with a well-placed strike. Yeah, okay, well-placed strike. I seem to remember something. Yeah, Season 1 sure did show Mando could be damaged in the gaps in his armor. Hell, Season 1 even shows Moff Gideon specifically giving Mando a real banger, which is understandable. The armor is extremely hard, but doesn't necessarily protect him from concussive force. And I mean, like we just determined, Law of Averages says that if Mando's enemies manage to score enough on-target hits, they'll eventually land one in the gaps in his armor. Well, let's see how many hits the enemies in Season 2 score on Mando, how many times they miss entirely, and how many times they hit his armor. For the purposes of this count, I will only be using scenes where I can clearly see that the enemies are targeting Din specifically. I will not be counting blocks or parries that Mando performs, except when he uses his armor to do it, as his armor is obviously still a factor in that instance. And I will obviously be omitting any scene where someone is intentionally missing, such as this. In addition, there is a shot where an enemy uses a machete of some sort to knock a blaster out of Mando's hand. I felt it obviously wouldn't be fair to count that as a miss, but Mando's arm is stretched out in such a way that the enemy could have easily hit Mando in the armor gap, possibly cutting his arm off, so I elected to split the difference and count it as an armor hit. If you disagree, that's fine. That was my reasoning and how I chose to count it. All in all, it doesn't make a huge difference in the count. Okay, let's see.
Looking good?
Here.
We have a deal.
Now, if the enemies in The Mandalorian score 92 direct hits, 100% of them on Mando's indestructible Beskar armor, and miss the other 97 shots they take directly at Mando, why would anyone who is paying attention ever believe that Mando could ever get hit in between his armor plates ever again? They hit him only 5 fewer times than they miss him, which, by the way, is exceptional for an average foot soldier. In fact, it's much closer to a sniper level of accuracy, so you can take your stormtrooper aim bullcrap and shove it. And not a single, not nary a one of these on-target hits is in the gaps in his armor. Perhaps if something were to happen where Din would be exposed to some sort of corrosive substance, his Beskar armor would be fine, sure, but the rest of his clothes would suffer quite a bit of damage and have to be taken off with great haste to avoid this substance burning through quickly. We could set up this substance, perhaps some sort of organic acid launched as a projectile, and to show its deadliness, a few nameless people could be killed by it before our very eyes. Then, some sort of circumstance could force Mando to go inside the very creature that just spit this acid out, and when he comes out obviously covered in the same substance, oh wait, no, he's fine. Please do not talk to me about the gaps in his armor. The creators of this show have rendered them completely meaningless. Steve, you bafflingly handsome simpleton, I hear you saying. What, do you want Din to get shot and almost bleed out every time he gets in a firefight? Does he have to get injured or messed up every episode for you to be satisfied and convinced he's in danger? No, my eternal love. But in order to evoke a convincing sense of danger, a character needs to have a convincing reason why he doesn't get hit. And as we've gone over before, most often the best way to do this is to have the character act like he might get hit and take action accordingly. To be completely fair, this does occasionally happen in Season 2. Most notably in Episode 3, where Din, along with 3 other Mandalorians, board and forcibly commandeer an Imperial Remnant freighter. The Mandalorians use cover, use smokescreen concealment when they can't, and even when Din runs out into the open under direct fire like an idiot, he has a damn good reason for it, as it's his last-ditch effort to make it into the cockpit before the ship crashes, so it's understandable. Unlike in the fight with the Crate Dragon, where jumping into the creature's mouth is his last-ditch effort to get back Boba Fett's armor without having to fight the Marshal for it? The point is that Mandalorians act like they could be damaged here. They're not just walking from point A to point B as if they know they're the good guys of the story and they'll make it to the end no matter what. On multiple occasions in The Mandalorian Season 2, Din acts like he's the invincible tank the creators have quite transparently made him. Din walks out in front of multiple enemies, stands in highly visible locations. He even all but says he's invincible because of his Beskar armor to Boba Fett. No, let's look at this one. So in Season 2, Episode 6, Chapter 14, The Tragedy 2, The Legend of Curly's Gold, Boba Fett obliquely threatens Din, telling Din he's working with a sharpshooter that's up on that ridge, to which Din replies that,
I'm the one wearing Beskar. As soon as I see that muzzle flash, you're both dead.
But Din, what about the gaps in your armor? It's a sharpshooter. You're standing still. Gaps. Din, please! You see, my unreasonably attractive viewers, if you believe these gaps in Din's armor are significant at this point, and that a reasonably skilled aggressor could damage him, then Din continuing to talk himself up after he's been threatened in a stationary position with a sharpshooter maybe shows a confidence that's a little excessive. Maybe a little exaggerated? This sort of behavior is what's commonly referred to as hubris, and it can have a welcome and useful place in the development of some characters.
Take them together. You're going slowly on the left.
Taking him now.
No, Anakin, no! No!
Don't get me wrong, guys, the prequels are quite bad. Attack of the Clones spectacularly so. But Anakin's hubris leading to his dismemberment is not an example of bad writing. Din's hubris, however, is rewarded time and time again with success. But Steve, his hubris leads to Boo Boo Baba getting baby napped. No! An incredibly nonsensical and transparent contrivance, which artificially reduces Din's mobility, leads to that.
Tell her to drop the gun.
After you put down the jetpack.
His jetpack? His jetpack! Fett, he still has a gun pointed at you. Why are you talking about his jetpack? Then, when the stormtroopers land and Din is in a huge hurry to get back to Grogu, he for no reason at all forgets to put his jetpack back on, which would have been the fastest way to get back to him. This is such lazy writing. Okay, back on topic. So now we have a demonstrably invincible warrior who not only acts as if he is invincible repeatedly, but outright states it. Even all this is not a problem if we have a cunning, competent, and dedicated enemies who are out to take him down. After all, we as the audience love little more than to see a man on high brought low under the weight of his own hubris. So how are our enemies in this Season 2 of The Mandalorian? Well, we have a problem with our antagonists too, it seems. Rarely in my many years of copious media consumption have I witnessed such a broad array of completely incompetent enemies. To be completely fair to Din Djarin, if I was a bounty hunter and all of my competition was as mind-bogglingly stupid and useless as almost every enemy Din encounters in Season 2, I might feel invincible too. In addition to the complete failure to hit any part of Mando that might take a slight amount of damage from any blaster or melee attacks, the rank and file of the forces opposed to Mando seem to be completely and utterly inept at just about any task. They lock protagonists in rooms ideally suited to kill them. They can't even drive their vehicles without crashing into stationary terrain with no outside interference whatsoever. What is going on? But Steve, you terminally sexy fool, stormtroopers have always been incompetent cannon fodder. No, my friend, they have not. Stormtroopers are not incompetent, they are selectively incompetent. Imperial stormtroopers throughout the majority of the original trilogy, in fact, until the infamous and laughable ground assaults on the combined Rebel Ewok forces in the Battle of Endor, are well established as a deadly, powerful force of effective ground troops. Stormtrooper aim, as it's called, is a cultural meme born likely in misunderstanding of the original trilogy and perpetuated by later works which embraced this meme, most notably the season finale of Season 1 of The Mandalorian, which did all but explicitly state its canon status. But let's do a quick look at the first few appearances of Stormtroopers. 1. The very first battle of all Star Wars involves Stormtroopers under the direct command of Darth Vader absolutely wiping the floor with Rebel troops escorting Leia Organa and the plans to the first Death Star to Yavin 4. The Stormtroopers, coming through a choke point airlock with no cover, handily dispatch the Rebels laying in wait behind cover in the hallways and subdue Leia with a stun blast. 2. Stormtroopers comb the desert, looking for escapees from Leia's Corvette, and start looking for C-3PO and R2-D2, which leads them to the Jawa Sandcrawler, the remains of which are found by Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. A cursory glance over the wreckage leads Obi-Wan to remark,
"These last points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise."
3. Oh no! 4. Stormtroopers are seen as a looming threat throughout the time spent in Mos Eisley. Han Solo manages to kill a few stormtroopers during his hasty retreat into the Millennium Falcon. The stormtroopers in this scene do seem to be missing an awful lot, admittedly. 5. Our heroes encounter a massive force of stormtroopers aboard the Death Star. The stormtroopers appear easily foolable and cannot hit the broadside of a bantha. Also, they do this.
Take over.
This is our second example of the selective incompetence of stormtroopers and their poor aim, except that that is directly contradicted in this line just a few moments later.
They let us go. It's the only explanation for the ease of our escape.
Most, if not all, of the alleged incompetence exhibited by the stormtroopers aboard the Death Star can be explained by this simple line. 6. Stormtroopers, along with Darth Vader, storm the rebel base on Hoth after successful assault by the AT-ATs. They attempt to set up a G-Web and are taken out by the Millennium Falcon's defense turret. Where their laser blasts hit is not shown. 7. Stormtroopers under the command of Darth Vader and with the compliance of Lando Calrissian infiltrate Cloud City and destroy C-3PO, then capture Leia, Han Solo, and Chewbacca. 8. When Luke arrives to rescue his friends, he is ambushed by Boba Fett and stormtroopers, who have specific orders not to kill him. Leia literally screams, "Luke, don't hit the trap!" as the stormtroopers make near misses firing at Luke. Lando orders his men to turn on the stormtroopers, giving our heroes the cover they need to escape. Stormtroopers pursue Leia, Lando, and Chewbacca carrying C-3PO as they flee. They run, take evasive action, and take cover as they escape. Once again, the stormtroopers seem to miss a lot. The characters they are shooting at are taking action to avoid fire, however. 9. The scout troopers have a speeder battle with Luke and Leia. A scout trooper crashes into a tree because he is distracted by the battle, not for no reason. 10. Stormtroopers get wrecked by teddy bears. This is the beginning of the end for our once fearsome Imperial force. So, once we review all this, we find that stormtroopers in the OT are extremely effective about 2/3 of the time. Well, I don't agree that stormtroopers have always been useless cannon fodder. They do seem to have a small problem with selective efficacy in the original trilogy, and this I will concede. I will also state, however, that when the frequency of these inconsistencies is much smaller, they can be much easier to accept or ignore, especially when you account for the behavior of the people they are firing upon being a reasonable explanation for some, not all, of their misses. Make no mistake, this is a problem in the original trilogy as well. That does not make it magically okay in The Mandalorian. While this history can help add context to how we perceive stormtroopers culturally and as a fandom, the problems with them in The Mandalorian can still be examined in isolation, as The Mandalorian itself wants to have its cake and eat it too with our favorite white-clad goons. It wants to have scenes like this, and still wants you to feel tension when the characters are threatened with this. It wants you to feel fear and see the deadly skill of the Imperial stormtroopers, but just one episode later wants you to laugh at how terrible at aiming the exact same soldiers are. Make no mistake, the Imperial remnant under Moff Gideon is clearly communicated as a serious threat when the show piles up multiple suits of Mandalorian armor and tells you the Empire did this. We can zoom even farther in and show that Season 2 specifically is extremely guilty of this. Season 2 wants you to feel tension in a speeder chase, but makes the scout troopers so laughably clumsy that they can't even get down the driveway without suffering 50% losses. It is so greedy for a big, shiny, action-packed explosion that it does absolutely no work in getting there. I simply cannot fathom at which point of the production process this decision was made. Because the sentence, "Wouldn't it be cool if two of them crash on the way down the mountain and explode into fire for no reason whatsoever," sounds so incomprehensibly idiotic, no matter if it comes from the writers, or the director, or someone in post-production. I've heard in response to this scene that these troopers are stationed at a research base, which means that they're either lax in training or lacking in experience. I feel this is a poor excuse, especially when it is clearly communicated in the show itself that the research being performed here is of great importance to Moff Gideon's Imperial Remnant and Moff Gideon himself, and as such would warrant a garrison of competent guards. Even if the guards here are out of practice and lacking in experience in driving the very vehicles they are issued to perform their duties as scouts, Is it at all reasonable to use this to justify why they are unable to simply get the hundreds of yards from the facility to the canyon floor without creating a horrific burning wreck with no interference whatsoever? Is it reasonable to believe that a half-blind accountant who is afraid of everything is able to avoid their attacks and even take one of them down? Oh yeah, he's half-blind.
Let me assure you, I do not want to spend any more time in carbonite. Still can't see out of my left eye.
But hey, let's take all that as a given, that this is perfectly sound reasoning and it's not distractingly goofy that this crash occurs. Let's take a look at another group of stormtroopers in The Mandalorian Season 2, the battalion of stormtroopers guarding the Imperial base on Morak. After a chase scene, part of which we're gonna talk about, don't you worry, Din and Mayfield find themselves in the lion's den of an Imperial base. After Mayfield has a conversation with his old commanding officer, which results in him flipping out and doing a murder, and he and Din mopping up the soldiers and the officers' mess, which apparently fails to initially draw the attention of the dozens of Imperial troops we just saw in the next room, our heroes make a narrow escape under fire of Imperial stormtroopers and a pair of TIE fighters. Not once do these troopers hit any of our heroes, even though they move slowly, nor do the TIE fighters hit Slave One despite Boba Fett taking no evasive action whatsoever. Yeah, Steve, what's your point? Stormtrooper aim, remember? Lol. Except these very troopers were just shown to be extremely accurate in their fire. At the end of the chase scene, they saved Din and Mayfield with a volley of fire so incredibly precise that it may be described as statistically unlikely. They don't appear to miss a single shot. And those two TIE fighters, the same TIE fighters we saw missing Slave One, they're so precise in their aim that they can lay down a line of fire that misses what they think is their ally in the, a truck. Why is it a truck? Why are you transporting volatile materials on wheels when you have floating cars? What are you doing? And lays direct hits on the speeders pursuing them. Hitting a ship traveling directly away from you, directly in front of you, taking no evasive maneuvers whatsoever is an easier shot than this, and they miss. These enemies are either stupidly useless, or they are bafflingly deadly. The writing is so transparently contrived, it's disgusting. The Mandalorian refuses to make up its mind. Are these troopers clumsy or precise? Are they effective deadly soldiers or useless bumbling cannon fodder? After what we see in The Mandalorian, and specifically in Season 2, the only sensible conclusion is that they are both. They are whatever the writers need them to be for that specific moment in the story, and there are no rules, there are no stakes, and there can be no tension, because whatever happens, it's not due to the rules, it's due to the whims of the writers. But we're here to talk about Moff Gideon. It was my initial intention, which I've already broken repeatedly in this video, to focus only on the text of the show itself. However, through multiple conversations, it has become quite clear to me that, especially when it concerns a multimedia franchise as large as Star Wars, someone will always use reference from a supporting piece of media to supplement deficiencies in another. You may have heard this argument phrased as, "If you'd read the books, you'd know," or "The Clone Wars TV show explains," or even, "In the original trilogy." Now, in some media, it is perfectly reasonable for the creator to have an expectation of their audience possessing knowledge of other works. You shouldn't expect to have everything about a fictional universe explained every episode of a television series, though many television series offer recaps of important and relevant events prior to the start of the new content. Sequels can't be expected to rehash the entirety of their predecessors, though some subtle reminders can be helpful in aiding the understanding of a viewer new to the characters and events of their world. But in a world with as much sprawling, varied media and such a diverse fan base, with various levels of investment and interest as Star Wars, it is unreasonable and foolish to expect every viewer to have previous knowledge of every piece of previous media in the associated fictional universe. It is fine to have moments that viewers who actually have this knowledge can get a bit of excitement or recognition from. These moments are what is known as fan service, and are not only acceptable, but welcome as long as they do not prevent your viewers from understanding the story they are watching. Thus, when Ahsoka Tano asks some lady in Episode 5,
"Where is your master?" Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?
Fans of Clone Wars, Rebels, and the now Legends status Thrawn trilogy of novels can feel a tinge of recognition, leading either to excitement or dismay at the use of this fan-favorite character, while those unfamiliar with the Admiral can still feel a sense of mystery in the narrative cliffhanger of Ahsoka's appearance. Well, what does all this have to do with Moff Gideon? As I've claimed before, Moff Gideon is not properly set up as an adequate enough threat to properly establish tension in the context of a melee fight against Din. What do we know about Moff Gideon? We know he's a Moff, a high rank within the Empire. We know he is competent with a blaster and is able to pilot a TIE fighter. We know that he has some level of renown, as both Din and Cara Dune have knowledge of him. Din says he heard his name spoken as an ISB officer during the Imperial Purge of Mandalore. Now, if you're like me and hadn't seen Rebels, you most likely either ignored that part of the line or said, "What is the ISB?" The Imperial Security Bureau are an Imperial intelligence agency, and it makes sense they would be heavily utilized in intelligence gathering on possibly seditious planets and organizations. Oh look, they can't drive speeders either. That's nice. If reasonable assumptions and parallels to real-world intelligence agencies are to be drawn, there are several different types of ISB members, from field agents and undercover operatives to analysts and command staff. Moff Gideon is referred to as an officer, which is useless as it can mean any number of things in the context of military law enforcement. If he was an agent, like this finely sideburn character known as Callus, then he'd almost certainly have a few fights under his belt. But he's not called an agent, he's called an officer, which, in the context of Rebels, seems simply to refer to the Navy officers and command staff. Some might hand-wave this away and say obviously they meant agent, but if this is the one instance that we have to establish Gideon's backstory, training, and capabilities, then why did they use such an ambiguous term instead of agent? Also, if you go further into lore presented in some new canon books, the ISB has, in addition to standard command officers, what are called loyalty officers, which seem to function much like KGB party officials in former Soviet states. So I'd understand if I'd seen Rebels, but if I'd seen Rebels and read some official books, I'd be even more confused. Which level of knowledge is the correct one? So if Gideon was a loyalty officer or a command officer, which is more likely given his eventual rise to the lofty title of Moff, then how are we to know he's received the melee training necessary to take on a heavily trained tank of a warrior such as Din Djarin? I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's never shown or stated that he's competent with the Darksaber beyond being able to turn it on and cut a hole in a TIE fighter. When the only tiny kernel of information regarding Moff Gideon's abilities with melee weapons is a throwaway line referring to an intelligence agency which has members of widely varying duties and capabilities, which is never shown in a piece of media that you can reasonably expect the majority of your audience has seen. No, I'm sorry, but Rebels is a children's television show, and you cannot expect everyone to have seen it, or worse, for adults to screen it as a prerequisite prior to viewing The Mandalorian. Then the setup is inadequate. Steve, you horrendously charismatic dolt. You've already said Gideon is shown to be competent with a blaster. We can assume he's also good with the Darksaber since he carries it. No. Vasily Zaitsev was by all accounts an incredibly deadly sniper, but that doesn't mean I will assume that if I took away his Mosin Nagant and gave him a pair of boxing gloves that he'd be able to take down Muhammad Ali. Combat does not work like that. Skills do not work like that. Marksmanship does not translate to melee weapons. If only there were some sort of previously existing example for this in the Star Wars universe. Some sort of soldier who, although he's extremely competent with blasters, picks up a lightsaber and gets his butt handed to him pretty much immediately. No? Nothing? Oh well. Anyway, yes, Moff Gideon does carry the Darksaber. It is reasonable to assume that he has used it, and maybe even practiced with it. But he is going up against Din Djarin, a warrior that the show wants you so badly to believe is an extremely formidable fighter.
I have never met a Mandalorian. I've only read the stories. If they are true, you will make quick work of it.
I'm a Mandalorian. Weapons are part of my religion.
You are a Mandalorian, right?
Sir, I've read a lot about your people. Tribe, if half of what I read is
We
true...
have money.
Yeah, but running with a Mandalorian, that brought us some reputation.
Someone tell me why we even need a Mandalorian.
Well, apparently they're the greatest warriors in the galaxy.
Never met a real Mandalorian. Heard stories. I know you're good at killing. This here is a Mandalorian. You know what that means?
Oh, we've heard the stories.
Then you know how good they are at killing.
And we need to know why Moff Gideon, personally, is a threat to Din in particular, as it is Din he is fighting. Take the opening scene to Infinity War for an excellent example of this. Thanos defeats Hulk handily in single combat. Having seen in previous films the death and destruction the Hulk personally has caused and the immense trouble other characters have had subduing him, we know that Thanos, in his victory, is someone to be unbelievably scared of. His formidableness is shown to us firsthand when he dispatches the Hulk. Now imagine that instead of this scene and several others in Infinity War, the only inkling of his capabilities was two characters in another room saying he was a member of a powerful army defeated 5 years ago by the Nova Corps from Guardians of the Galaxy, and watching him punch a hole in a wall. His role in the army is not fully explained beyond saying he was an officer, and his capabilities are not expanded upon. Would his arrival in Wakanda make you say, "Oh my god, no, he's here"? Or would it simply make you curious as to what he's going to do? If you say your reaction is the first, fine. You are easily told, that is the bad guy, fear him, and have no problem doing as the media tells you, but many of us require a bit more to feel that way, and demand that the creators put in a bit more work in the form of setup. But Steve, at the end of Season 1, Moff Gideon almost kills Din. He's set up as dangerous and direct conflict with Din. Yes, there is a scene in the season finale of Season 1 in which Din suffers what appears to be life-threatening injury and brain damage. During the Cantina standoff, Din makes his way out into the streets to engage Moff Gideon's forces. Gideon fires a single shot at Din, striking him in his invincible armor because, of course he does. But then Gideon does something unexpected. He aims at a device or tank or something near Din, causing it to explode and knocking Din off his feet. Din is critically injured, requiring him to remove his helmet later so that IG-11 can heal him with magic spray, because, sure, why not? Healing is that easy in the Star Wars universe now, isn't it? Didn't used to be, sure. Anyway, the point is that Din does get injured by the explosion, even though it has literally no narrative consequences, as Din is fine moments later when he meets back up with his allies, and this entire scene exists only as an excuse for Pedro Pascal to show his face. This does not make me fear for Din's life in single combat with Gideon, and it shouldn't make you fear for it either. It should make you fear for his life when he's near explosives. Oh, and by the way, Din is immune to those now too. In Season 2, Episode 7, Din is once again blown off his feet by a nearby explosion, and he is fine. No brain damage, no bleeding, no Bacta spray necessary, and he's not even wearing his Beskar. This is the contrivance of the showmakers laid bare. They want their action scene, and they don't want the hard work of the consequences for the characters involved unless it suits their needs. For those of you who believe I'm nitpicking, or that I should just turn my brain off, or any number of other it doesn't matter cop-outs, let me pose to you a question. It's been well established through dialogue and lore that the Darksaber cannot cut through Beskar. Cannot do it. Not gonna happen. So imagine if, during the fight between Gideon and Din, if at this moment, the Darksaber just sliced right through Din's arms and liberated his hands from his body. If you would shrug your shoulders and say, I guess they'll explain it next season, then I will address you at the end of the video. But if you would stand up and say, that's not right, lightsabers can't cut through Beskar, and you are okay with this, then I will suggest you ask yourself why you are okay with the showmakers turning certain rules on and off at their whims, but not others. So, back on task, we have a narratively indestructible protagonist going up against a narratively underdeveloped threat of an enemy in a fight where we have very little reason to fear for the loss of the former.
It cannot cut through pure Beskar.
And very little reason to fear the capabilities of the latter. At this point, I have heard two different responses. One, Moff Gideon wasn't expecting to fight Mando here. He was caught in the middle of his escape. And two, Moff Gideon wasn't trying to beat Mando. It was his intention to be defeated to screw over Bo-Katan. So let's tackle both of these one at a time. Moff Gideon was trying to escape and got caught by surprise. This argument in particular holds very little water with me. Now, some concessions. It is quite reasonable to assume that Moff Gideon was informed of Din's fight with the Dark Trooper in real time, if in fact he was not watching it directly himself, and was aware of the Dark Troopers being thrown out of the airlock as soon as it happens. It's just a little over a minute in screen time from that happening to Din walking into Grogu's cell, but jumps in time are common and expected to be able to tell a story that takes place over the course of more than a couple hours, and we can expect that Gideon had enough time to make it to the cell before Din. No problem. Here are the problems, though. If he was trying to quickly escape, why post guards at the door and not have them looking down the hall for approaching threats? Why only bring 2 guards? If his intention was to abandon the ship, why not bring as many people with him as possible to maximize his chances of escape?
No, my beautiful viewer, I did not miss this part.
In the old days, it would carry a crew of several hundred. Now it operates with a tiny fraction of that.
But even considering that, if Moff Gideon didn't have enough troopers to take with him to escape, then who are all these guys? And no, that's not the cargo bay. That's the hallway to the bridge where Moff Gideon just was. He could have taken any of these troopers with him.
If he was trying to run in and grab Grogu real quick and get out of there, why even close the door? Why have the last line of dialogue he utters before this scene be "release the Dark Troopers" and not "ready my escape pod" or anything that remotely hints he intends to escape? If this is what Moff Gideon was intending, to escape, then the show has done a piss-poor job of communicating it. And in fact, several pieces of on-screen evidence contradict it. Moff Gideon wanted to be defeated to screw over Bo-Katan. Okay, so this argument is a little better, but not by much.
To be fair, this is probably exactly what the writers intended, but they bungled the execution, and here's why.
Moff Gideon tells us that the Darksaber has power, that whoever holds it has the right to rule Mandalore. So could this fight have been an elaborate ploy by Moff Gideon to create a divide among the Mandalorians under Bo-Katan's command as to who would rule? Well, again, the evidence of the show itself and some other Star Wars media is a little inconsistent. If you want to go only by the Mandalorian itself, and believe me, I do, God, so much, Moff Gideon planned to, what? Screw over Bo-Katan and then die? Did he not expect the Dark Troopers to reboard his ship? Is the man who claims to know everything not aware of the capabilities and programming of his own droid soldiers? Didn't seem to come as a surprise to him when the troopers boarded while he was captive, and he seemed quite sure of their inevitable victory over Din and his allies. So what? He wanted to create a rift between Din and Bo-Katan for like 10 minutes before the Dark Troopers annihilated them all and he got the Darksaber back? If so, why even bother with the initial deception and this from-behind surprise attack if he intended to lose all along? And if he intended to lose thinking the Dark Troopers would succeed and rescue him, or simply wanted to be away from the bridge when Bo-Katan showed up, why in the hell would he initiate a fight and plan for Din not to kill him? He is quite obviously surprised that Din spares his life, so what is going on? His behavior is inconsistent with any possible motive I've been able to think of beside the man being quite literally suicidal. And for those of you that insist on bringing a comprehensive knowledge of a multiple-season children's television show into a discussion about The Mandalorian, as recently as the Clone Wars, the wielder of the Darksaber was not necessarily the ruler of Mandalore. They were the ruler of the Death Watch, a radical extremist group which insinuated itself through deception and manipulation into being a shadow government of Mandalore. The Death Watch leader didn't defeat the ruler of Mandalore in single combat. He used cooperation with a crime syndicate to fabricate an attack on Mandalore and then further fabricate a military response to it to gain the favor of the people. Bo-Katan went along with all of this. It was only when Darth Maul won the Darksaber by challenge of single combat that she split from the wielder of the Darksaber, declaring,
"Never! No outsider will ever rule Mandalore."
So if the story is what matters to Bo-Katan and the people, but she's perfectly okay with fabricating a terrorist coup so that her organization can falsely claim a military victory over them to deceive the people into supporting them politically, why would she not be okay with lying about how she reacquired the Darksaber? And even if Moff Gideon acquired the Darksaber from her in single combat, why would she care about defeating him in single combat if she doesn't recognize non-Mandalorians as legitimate wielders of the Darksaber and its associated political power. If you want to claim character development, fine, let's do that. Bo-Katan does seem to be a completely different character in her Rebels appearances, during which she literally accepts the Darksaber without defeating its wielder. This entire situation gives me a nosebleed. This conflict setup is full of holes. It is bleeding out. Please, somebody save it.
Here's the deal, guys. Most of us have heroes. People we look up to because their values, their qualities, their triumphs have shown us what our better selves are capable of. Media, especially fantasy and sci-fi, can show us the struggles of heroes against the forces of evil, and the triumph of light over dark. When those struggles, however, are reduced to trivialities, the triumphs, too, are diminished. I think I've shown that The Mandalorian Season 2 does just this. Any opposition the Mandalorian or his allies face in this season up until Din's fight with Gideon is rolled over without incident, without danger, without tension. I suppose with that, I've made my argument. Long ago, there was a time when I could honestly say that I loved Star Wars. And indeed, there are still pieces of this universe that hold a special place in my heart. There are even pieces of Disney's attempt at Star Wars that set my imagination alight. The revelation of a middle-aged man that the creed he was raised under is a fringe cult denounced as radical outsiders, even by those once considered radical outsiders. The bubbling anger of a soldier against the careless orders of a commander, under which he saw his friends die needlessly. The promise of a man thought a villain, to break a seemingly endless cycle of conflict and carve out something new. But when that middle-aged man simply denies his upbringing, and it's never mentioned again, when the soldier turns on the rank and file that he was so angry over the loss of, when the actions of the man begging for a new way simply maintain the status quo, when these ideas are tossed out and just as soon discarded, it is a hollow proposal to the viewer. A jangling of keys that demands we imagine a meal far more satisfying than the one we are served, which ultimately leaves us hungry. If you tell me, simply, that you enjoy The Mandalorian Season 2, I may ask you what you enjoy about it, but you'll get no argument from me. Your enjoyment is yours to have, and I have no intention of taking it from you. If you tell me it is good, I will not tell you that you are wrong, but I will ask you what you mean by good, because we obviously have different criteria for good, and that's fine with me too. But if you tell me it is well written, that the narrative is expertly crafted, and that the emotional payoffs are well earned and meaningful, and especially that the action scenes are packed with stakes and tension and nail-biting moments, then I will disagree, and I will tell you why. This is not a fight, folks. It's a discussion. This video is not a declaration that I have solved anything, or that I have all the information and have recognized and considered all possible factors. I am open to learning. I am open to good faith discussions about this material. So, feel free to tell me why you think I'm right or wrong in the comments. I'll respond to all good faith conversation. If you've made it this far through the video, I give you my sincere thanks for hearing me out, and I will show you the same courtesy. Truly, thank you for watching. This is my first effort at this kind of media criticism video. Those of you who have seen my previous works will certainly notice a radical departure. So feel free to let me know if you'd like to see more of this type of content. I'm truly interested in your thoughts. You can also tell me why I'm an alt-right Nazi on Twitter, or yell at me while I play video games on Twitch. Links in the description. I'd like to give very special thanks to Forging Wynton, Soapboxklotz, and KitKattheKatKat for helping me flesh out my ideas and learn more about the media I use to make my arguments. Your help has been invaluable, and I love you all. Forging Wynton is a blacksmith who live streams his craft on Twitch. Soapboxklotz streams video games and produces podcasts. And KitKattheKatKat plays Minecraft and other games. Check out links to all of their media in the description. Once again,
Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.